He stared at Vichy, surprised by her words. She couldn't understand the anger of the prince when this issue didn't concern him. He looked away as he denied her words, but Vichy insisted that what she saw wasn't wrong because he'd raised his voice with fury etched on his face. Karen insisted that what she'd just witnessed was him expressing his discontent at their informant's false information. They'd agreed to exchange reliable information, and such information shouldn't have included any unnecessary ulterior motives. Convinced by his words, Vichy bowed with an apology. Karen set the letter down as he speculated that there was almost no chance of the village negotiators returning home alive. But they knew that the emperor's impulsive actions would only further validate the rumors. There were rumors that the emperor was a puppet under the Nagi people's curse, and of course the nobles wouldn't sit back quietly as well. They would further drive the wedge of doubt deeper that Her Highness had manipulated the emperor into killing her village people all to conceal her Nagi identity. Vichy knew such circumstances proved favorable for them, and she wanted to know if they should aid in spreading the rumors. But Karen disagreed, as he stated that he planned to help Her Highness. Vichy looked at the prince, bewildered by his words. He explained that if she were to seek her vengeance now, it would be no different than the rumors stated. And the common people would surely follow the word of the nobles since they held much influence. Vichy had grown confused the more the prince spoke, because that was exactly what they wanted. They needed to jeopardize the emperor as well as Her Highness's position in order for them to make the decisions they desired. But the prince stubbornly insisted that even with his help, nothing would change. He would only aid so that Her Highness safely ascended to the title of Heigi without any harm. But Vichy reminded the prince that that was exactly what they needed to prevent. But the prince had long since stopped listening to Vichy's ramblings, and he clutched at his head, overcome with worry. To appease Vichy, he cooked up a tale of only doing so to gain Her Highness's trust. If he helped her, she would certainly look at him in a new light. But Vichy did not look convinced by his words, and she wondered if there was more to it than the prince let on. She looked at the prince, her eyes reflecting a threatening glint as she reminded the prince that her family had risked everything for him, and the prince quietly acknowledged her words. "Write a reply," Karen ordered. "That it's finally time for the emperor to come to my bed," he stated. Back at Bayan's palace, the emperor spoke with Suyin, and she worriedly told him that Bayan refused to take dinner since she'd been feeling out of sorts. Suyin wasn't aware of the reason, but only that she'd been that way since the concubine's visit earlier. The emperor ordered that Suyin prepare a light meal and left to do just that. He stepped through the doors, ready to greet Bayan, but he was taken aback by her as Bayan rushed forward into Dan's arms. He looked at her, her face buried in his chest, and called out her name in question, but she refused to look up. And when he ordered her to do so, she looked up at him with tearful eyes. Dan flinched at the sight of her tears, and as he demanded to know who made her cry, she interrupted him as she begged, "Please embrace me, Your Majesty." And before he could answer, she pulled Dan into a deep kiss. She tore at his clothes, wanting to be closer, and her urgency was infectious. He hauled Bayan onto the desk and, with a heated gaze, reprimanded, "Don't tempt me, you won't be able to handle it." But tonight, Bayan displayed her want for Dan clearly, and she leaned forward. She bit at his neck, and he flinched at her uncharacteristic behavior. He knew he would give Bayan what she wanted because he could never deny his lady. And after their passionate embrace, they gazed at each other in contentment. She broke the silence as she questioned why the emperor had yet to ask her about her behavior, but he playfully wanted to know what exactly he was supposed to ask. And when he confirmed he indeed had no questions, she sat up as she asked a question of her own. "Were you never curious why I wanted more power?" But he responded that no, he wasn't. What he was curious about was why she'd skipped dinner. Bayan flinched at his words, and Dan grabbed her hand, and she watched as he gently laid a kiss atop her knuckles. She felt comforted by his actions, even though she knew that the emperor knew nothing of her past. And so Bayan looked down, ready to tell the emperor. She explained that the reason she wanted power was to destroy her native village. To obliterate it and leave no trace behind. She was ready to accept the emperor's scorn for her vile and evil thoughts, but Dan looked at her with understanding as he stated that she must have her reasons. Bayan felt overwhelmed with emotions for the man in front of her, for she knew that Dan was someone who always gave her unwavering support. And finally, she opened up to the emperor as she explained that the village people poisoned her mom. They had removed the last obstacle in their way to send Bayan to the palace as a concubine. She could still feel the weight of her mom on her back as she wandered the mountains in search of help, whenever she closed her eyes. The violent blizzard and her legs going numb from the bitter cold. She could still feel the rope that held her mom to her, digging deep into her skin. The multitude of emotions that ran rampant through her, the fear and helplessness as she cried out for someone to help her. And when she'd returned with her mom's lifeless body in her arms, the body that she'd held onto for days, hoping that she'd come back alive. Bayan smiled bitterly at her foolishness. She trembled with rage and her desire for revenge. She wanted to hand them a death so painful and brutal that they would beg for nothing but mercy. But it seemed like disease would take their lives before they ever got the chance, and she hated that they would die with or without her intervention. But Dan stopped her as he asked who shared with her such information, and she explained that the concubine Karen had told her that this was their divine punishment since they dared to hunt seos like her. Original seos with black hair and blood that healed. But Dan warned Bayan not to fall victim to every word she heard. But Bayan explained that was not the case because if it were any other concubine, she would have sowed seeds of doubt. Concubine Karen had no ulterior motive for sharing this information. But the emperor wondered what caused Bayan such sadness, for she now had the power to capture those cretins. But Bayan was not who she used to be. When before she would have been blinded by anger and doled out her wrath on them, now she knew the higher one's position, the limited one's power is. And this was why she needed a valid reason everyone would acknowledge to use such authority. Dan caught on, and he waited for her to continue. She informed him that concubine Karen explained that if she became the Hagi, she would gain rights to participate in administrative affairs. And so she explained that she would like to use her power to control the tax laws implemented on the Seo because imperial taxes were one of their biggest fears. Once the taxes are raised, their profit from selling Ryona would soon dwindle, and they wouldn't be able to pay. That would then be their reason to bring down their hammer on the Ganek village. And Bayan would be at the forefront of it all, or so she'd planned until the emperor pointed out a few flaws in her plans. He explained that the Hagi only involved herself in the finances of the imperial household. Imposing taxes on the people and foreign lands were under the emperor's jurisdiction. But Dan graciously gave a solution to this. For instance, you can whisper in my ear and say, I despise the Seos, so please raise their taxes, your majesty. His words brought about confusion, and Bayan wondered what the emperor meant. He smiled at Bayan's obliviousness to the power she held, and he told her that this power was the one he cherished the most. Next, he pointed out that it would be impossible for her to stand at the vanguard of occupational forces since the Hagi wasn't permitted to participate in the war. It was also something he would never allow, even if she could. She sighed, realizing the errors in her plan. She knew as well that the village people would likely die before then as well. Dan wondered why she felt the need to wait, and he informed her that the village people were secretly on their way here, so she was to prepare herself. And when she wondered about his words, the emperor smiled deviously as he stated, prepared to be your most merciless self. And a new day brought new squabbles as Chugang complained about the smug-looking Gumwi guards. But Hassan was more concerned as to why Chugang would teach Her Highness such techniques. But how was he to know that she'd wanted such lessons to use on the emperor, he defended. But he pointed ahead as Gairang was at fault too for suggesting the emperor be tied up. And soon the three threw blame back and forth until Chugang dramatically stated that he worried about Her Highness with the Gumwi guards now that the emperor had assigned them such an important task. This asserted the truth that the emperor now truly trusted them. And soon they'd met up with Perak. Gairang greeted him cheerfully as Perak tossed a key in his direction. Gairang caught the key enthusiastically, happy to take the reins from here. And when he opened the door, 3 men bound in rope with bags over their heads awaited them. They trembled in fear of the unknown. Gairang ordered the men to strip them of their clothes, and they were to shave their heads too. The men could do nothing as the black wraiths did with them as they pleased. And soon they took an axe to the carriage until it was reduced to nothing but rubble. At last the men shouted out in fury, "Why are you doing this to us?" But Gairang made sure to remind them that they'd met once before, and that was in the Ganek village. And when at last they finally recalled his face, they shuddered knowingly, for they now knew who committed such a heinous act towards them. It was none other than the emperor. High Elder Danum was surprised to find the chief general in front of him. But Gairang stared at the old man in front of him. Sure, the man had looked much younger upon their previous meeting. He wondered aloud had they contracted a deadly disease. But High Elder Danum wanted answers of his own, and he questioned why they'd been treated in such a manner when they were called to the imperial palace to discuss their taxes with the emperor. He then launched into a self-important tirade, but Gairang quickly stopped that as he announced that there would be no negotiations. At Danum's look of confusion, he explained that they would spread a story about the COs that were attacked by a horde of bandits, and thereafter their bodies were eaten by hungry beasts, so how could they negotiate if their remains couldn't be found? And the person who will share this information with the Ganik village will be Perak. Danum demanded to know their wrongdoings for this treatment, but soon stopped as he realized that Bayan could be behind this. And when he desperately shouted out her name as he questioned Gairang, he simply stated, "How dare you speak Her Highness's name in vain?" Danum was furious as he realized the negotiations were nothing but mere bait. How dare she repay him like this when he spared her life despite the village people's demands he do otherwise? And now he knew that he should have taken her life the moment she was born. He questioned if they were to be treated like this at the request of a mere concubine, but he was quickly informed that she was not a mere concubine but Lady Zhongyin. The CO men reared back, stunned that not only had she survived the bloodthirsty emperor, but she'd seduced him enough to earn the title of Zhongyin, and so they saw no other way but to plead and convince the Black Wraiths and the emperor that Bayan was in fact an evil being. But if they were so eager to expose Bayan, Gairang wanted to know if they also shared the truth behind Bayan's mother's murder. The CO men gasped, and they quickly backtracked as they stated that was a matter that stayed within their tribe, and all he'd done was lead his people. Since he was practically their ruler, the empire had no business interfering with their affairs. But Gairang grinned mischievously as he told them once again, "You were killed by bandits." Danum was beginning to realize that there was no escape from these men, but he grinned, for he had never planned to travel to the empire unguarded. With a boost of confidence he threatened, "You will regret this." But Gairang waved his threat off and ordered that they be loaded into the carriage. Once done, Gairang ordered Chugang and Hassan to go down the mountain to spread word that men were killed by tigers. And so they departed for their destinations. And just as they'd planned, rumors began to circulate of a tiger ravaging men in the mountains. Gairang stood nearby, concealed but within listening distance, and he was glad his plan worked. Soon it would be discovered that it was none other than the negotiators that were attacked and killed by the tiger. But this elaborate plan was not of his own making but of the emperor. He was astonished that the emperor would go so far for the Lady Zhongyin. Back at Bayan's palace, Suyin assisted Bayan with her hair and, once done, stated that she would now be able to move around more easily without drawing too much attention. She fussed over Bayan, insisting that she was not doing anything too dangerous, and Bayan agreed. Suyin had shed tears of sorrow when she'd learned of Her Highness's past, and now she understood why she suffered from her sleepwalking illness. And how strong she was to have endured all she had. But now she was certain that Her Highness's suffering was over because the emperor had rounded up those vile men. She once again made Bayan promise not to get hurt, and she smiled softly at her lady. And soon Bayan stepped out to find the Black Wraiths who waited for her. "Are you ready, Your Highness?" they questioned, and Bayan stated simply, "Yes." Her eyes held a look of certainty, for this is what she'd been waiting for. They walked slowly down the steps that led to the dungeons, with only lint-lit torches to provide any light. She needed to keep a level head, she reminded herself. This was what she'd thought of hundreds of times over. And now she would see it through until the end. But for as much as she tried to remain calm, she trembled with nerves. So much so that she'd put out her torch. She felt her way along the wall, careful not to stumble with her weak legs. She flinched as a voice suddenly spoke up ahead of her as they warned her to be careful. She was surprised to find none other than the emperor who stood in front of her. She could not describe the overwhelming feeling of relief his presence brought her, and she ran forward, throwing herself in his arms. He laughed at her sudden actions, and he teased that he was not interested in his fellow men, referring to her outfit. But Bayan didn't mind his light teasing. In fact, she welcomed it all the more since it brought her such comfort. He continued his teasing as he stroked her face gently as he stated that her face was exactly his preference. She called out to him softly, and he said in return, "Don't call out to me so longingly. I already belong to my master." And his words had done exactly as he'd intended, and Bayan burst into a fit of giggles. He smiled, glad that teasing had relaxed her some. And now that she looked ready to head inside, he ushered her forward, as he stated he would wait for her outside. Hassan and Chugang unlatched the chains, and Bayan stepped forward, ready to face the men who were the cause of so much of her misfortune. She cast one last glance back towards Dan, who nodded encouragingly, and with a smile, she marched on forward. Soon she stood before another set of doors and, with shaky hands, pulled open the doors to reveal 3 bald-headed Seo men. Not sparing a moment, they crawled forward, begging Bayan for help, pleading for mercy. They all pleaded their cases separately, hoping Bayan would reach out a helping hand. Youngo spoke of her relationship with his daughter, but they were never friends. Chan spoke of the little pity he'd bestowed upon her by giving her rations, but that was the very same rations that had been poisoned. He'd also tried to violate her. Youngo put on a helpless air as he stated that he was forced to go along with the plan since he was always at their mercy. But Bayan knew better, and as he cried, Bayan turned to the only man who sat quietly, almost smugly. He laughed as he stated that her mother was nothing but a burden to her, and so he'd gotten rid of her. It was because of him that she now lived in such luxury. And because of this, she owed him much. His words snapped Bayan's last little bit of control, and she stated softly, "How dare you say my mom's name with that foul mouth of yours?" She clenched her fists tightly, trying to regain a semblance of control, and when she spoke, her voice was soft. "I know that you also assaulted her." Her words stunned Danum, and he wondered aloud how she'd found out. He trembled in terror, having realized what he'd just admitted to. He claimed it to be a mistake of his youth, and he'd reflected a lot since then, he claimed in a desperate voice. He pleaded for forgiveness, head to the ground. She explained that she'd never stated she would kill them because that would be an act of mercy since they would soon die from illness. Her words confused them, and she stated that they'd aged much, and she'd guessed that their healing powers must have also severely weakened. Danum couldn't understand how Bayan had discovered their secret since they'd made sure to keep it hidden. He turned around in fury, glaring at the 2 men. Sure, they'd told her, but they fervently denied it. She shared with them the reason for their illness. The reason their bodies deteriorated was because the blood that they'd share now ate away at their life force. Since their healing abilities were meant to heal others, the more they used their powers to heal, the quicker their lifespan shortened. And she smiled gleefully at Danum since he'd indulged in her blood the most. He clutched his head in despair, now understanding why he'd been worse for wear than the others. Youngo looked to Chan, and he nervously asked if they'd be okay, since they'd only drank a little of her blood, to which Chan nodded hopeful. But Bayan's words cast away their relief as she told them that they would suffer later too. If they were fated to die, then there was no need to stain her hands with their blood. She'd already told them that she wouldn't kill them, but then why were they locked up in this dungeon? They looked at her, confusion masked their faces. She told them that to escape from this room, they had 2 options. She flung a dagger, and it fell with a dull clang. She stated the first option. Take your lives with that dagger. She explained that if they all died by their own hands, she would rescind the order for imperial taxes. Danum shouted out in anger, not trusting Bayan's words. He was sure this was just a scheme to wipe out the village once they'd lost their lives. But there was still one more method to escape from this room, and that was to survive there for 1 month. She would then set them free. But how would they survive with nothing to eat or drink? They would starve to death. She would provide them with food, but it would only be 1 meal a day, and this meal would be shared amongst them. It would be enough to sustain them since she and her mom survived on their paltry portions for 18 years. Youngo smiled at her as he asked for 1 meal at this very moment. They'd consumed nothing but water for the last 6 days, and they were famished. She clapped her hands, and the black wraiths brought in their meal as promised. They salivated at the delightful smell as it permeated the air, but before they could dig in, Bayan spoke up. My mom's last meal was beef soup, rice, and leafy greens. She spoke with a knowing smile, and they looked at the food in front of them. It was exactly her mom's last meal, and they wondered if the food contained poison. One would need to act like a guinea pig to take the first bite, but who among them would it be? They looked at Danum, and he rushed forward, reaching for the dagger. His actions stunned them, and they looked at him in disbelief at his cowardice. Bayan sighed at their antics but decided to share a bit of information she'd learnt recently. They weren't seos, but rather cannibals who hunted and ate them for the healing abilities. They gasped at what Bayan's words implied. Were they to feed on each other? Danum knew he was likely to be fed on first. And so he begged Bayan to grant him an audience with the emperor since he had important information to share with the emperor. But Bayan only smiled as she wished them a happy meal. And with that, she turned and walked out the door. It slammed shut with a finality to it, and Danum turned to the two remaining men. He shook with terror at what was to come, and soon his screams could be heard. Back in the village, Jahan walked quietly, but the color of his hair attracted many eyes. And when finally he entered, he met with a man who now looked to the new elder of the village. The man told Jahan that he'd received a message from the former High Elder, Danum. The message had explained that a Nagi disguised as a Seo had taken up residence in the palace and had succeeded in seducing the emperor. They were tasked with revealing her true identity, and up until now, it has proven difficult. Danum had offered themselves up to testify as witnesses, but unfortunately, he was devoured by a tiger on his way. But Jahan stated that it was not a tiger that was the cause of his death. In fact, the elders were alive and well. They were locked up within the palace walls. Back at the palace, Dan stared down at Bayan, who had finally nodded off in a restless sleep. He'd thought about all he'd had to endure coming into his reign. He'd wiped out all who'd scorned him as a child. He acknowledged that it was nothing but revenge that drove him, and while he'd quenched his thirst for vengeance, his mind remained troubled. He'd wanted to know how Bayan felt once she'd accomplished her revenge, but Bayan was not done yet. She still had more to do, but now she felt less shameful as a daughter. He patted her gently as she stirred, and he wondered what dream caused her such distress. What was her dream about? Was it about her mother as she'd carried her through a violent blizzard weeping with fear and grief? He clasped her gently to him and laid a kiss on her forehead as he softly pleaded for her not to cry. His comforting warmth seemed to calm Bayan, and she slept soundly once more. His attention was suddenly drawn to the sharp presence of the Mukho outside their rooms. The black wraiths moved quickly as well. He knew something was wrong because the scent that wafted up to him triggered his animalistic instincts, and he drew Bayan closer to his body protectively. It was the smell of death in the air. In the palace yard, the black wraiths piled bodies up, assassins they'd identified, and Makrim gave chase to the one who'd escaped. And when Gairang searched the assailants' bodies, they came up with sleep-inducing poison, which was most likely to have been used in an attempted kidnapping of Her Highness. This annoyed Gairang since needles were most difficult to detect at night. They would inspect the area on Makrim's return, and they would dispose of the bodies. They were to go undetected by Her Highness since they'd made a mistake once before and were mocked relentlessly by the Gumwi guards. The emperor approached them almost silently, and he wanted a recount of the attackers. Gairang explained that the first attack happened 7 days ago, the second 3 days ago, and today was the third attack. Dan noted that the attacks were happening much faster than the last, and Gairang explained that the assassins grew in number with each attack. 2 the first time, 3 the second time, and 5 the third time. But the emperor only counted 4 bodies on the ground, and Hassan stated that Makrim pursued the last attacker. Capture him at all costs, Dan ordered, and the men bowed in consent to their emperor's wishes. It hadn't gone unnoticed by Dan that bloodshed had been on the rise since the announcement of the merit-based appointment system. He said the nobles felt highly intimidated since they chose to send assassins regardless of the black wraiths who stood guard. He knew that the palace was no longer safe for Bayan, and he questioned if the safe house was ready, to which Hassan stated that everything was. "We begin tomorrow," the emperor stated. The nobles gathered in the hall, and they brazenly spoke of their attempted assassinations. They'd heard of the last failed attempt, and they wondered who among them had sent them. The black wraiths are rather skilled. One noble stated disappointedly, and the other said that Mukho must stand guard as well. The noble smiled evilly as he stated that Minister Hong was in the process of collecting funds and has suggested that they commission every assassin guild. And if things went according to plan, Minister Hong would negotiate with the emperor on behalf of all nobles. But the noble grew outraged as he stated that they would need someone more experienced to represent the nobles, and soon their attention went to the door as another noble entered. It had been a long time since they'd seen this noble, since the Reuben incident. But he was not alone, and behind him walked a man with white hair. They speculated about his age, confused, it seemed since the man had white hair but a youthful appearance. But any further chatter ceased as the entry of the emperor was announced loudly. They bowed as he walked by, and soon he sat on his throne. He did not give the nobles time to speak and announced the first order of the day. I grant the office of Heian to Zhongin Baiyan. And sure enough, this threw the nobles in an absolute tailspin. The emperor was surely bewitched to have granted a promotion to the concubine once again. But they grinned maliciously because they knew that as long as they took her life before she reached Heigi, they would succeed in their plans. The noble bowed as he requested permission to speak. The emperor mocked the noble since he'd stayed absent from office on the guise of sickness, and the noble grew annoyed as soft laughter rang out around him. He stated that the rumors about Her Highness had shocked him, and so he'd launched a discreet investigation only to discover a shocking truth. The nobles looked dumbfounded, and this too had captured the emperor's attention. He called forward the man with white hair. The emperor's eyes widened in surprise as the boy revealed himself to be Jahan, the newly appointed elder of the Ganek village. The noble recalled his conversation with Jahan as he'd concluded that concubine Bayan was certainly a Nagi to have used the imperial taxes as bait to kidnap the elders who knew the truth. The noble smiled victoriously because he knew once the truth was revealed, the emperor could not stop the concubine's death. He would also be deemed incapable of handling political affairs under Nagi witchcraft. He would have no choice but to surrender the royal seal to the nobles who would handle government affairs on his behalf. He happily stated that under his rule the Ganek captives would be freed at once. But Jahan stated that the noble should lift the imperial taxes on his village as first order. The noble saw Jahan to be of greater intellect than he let on, and he stated proudly that would be as he wished. The emperor did not know the noble's intentions by bringing in this unidentified man, and so he questioned him, "Who are you?" The nobleman calmly asked for the emperor's forgiveness, for they had to disguise the boy to access the palace. He explained that after meeting the boy, he's come to realize that all those rumors were not as baseless as they'd thought. The boy stepped forward and stated that he'd come to confess the sin of the COs. The emperor could sense anger and sadness from the boy, and along with that, hostile envy. But his intrigue was soon replaced with outrage as soon as the words left Jahan's lips. "We have deceived your majesty," he said, "for the concubine we sent to represent our village is not of CO descent." The emperor burst out of his seat, fury emanating from him as he repeated, "Who are you?" With a determined glint in his eyes, he introduced himself as Jahan from the Ganek village. And soon news of what had transpired in the throne room spread like wildfire. Suyin entered the room, out of breath, exhausted from her run and from the panic. She told Bayan that a man named Jahan attended the council meeting and testified to Bayan not being a true CO. Suyin explained that if they did nothing, Bayan would be labeled as a Nagi. Bayan now realized that this had been Danam's plan all along, and she trembled in fury. Was it too late to negotiate with him in return for his freedom? She turned to Suyin as she questioned the whereabouts of Hassan and Chugang, and Suyin stated she'd last seen them withdrawing from the chambers. This surprised Bayan, and she worried if their actions meant that they'd taken Jahan's testimony as truth and had decided to abandon her. All these unexpected occurrences made Bayan nervous, as she didn't know what to make out of all of this. She briefly considered negotiating with Danam once more but soon discarded that idea. She would not do so, even if that meant she would soon face her own death. She sighed, releasing the tension from her body, and decided that she would discuss a plan of action once the emperor arrived. But Suyin informed Bayan that Mayunga stated that the emperor would like for Bayan to retire first for the night, and this news stunned Bayan. Dan had never requested that she sleep first, nor had Mayunga ever spoken on his behalf to her. She now took in Suyin's nervous gaze, and she asked, "What's going on?" But Suyan's eyes fluttered around anxiously, and Bayan called out her name once again, questioningly. Finally, she told Bayan about the rumor she'd overheard. I heard that His Majesty will be visiting concubine Karen's chambers tonight. And so Bayan summarized that upon hearing that she wasn't a CO, he'd lifted her protection and has decided to visit another concubine's bed chambers. She spoke quietly as she told Suyan to leave. Suyan watched her for a moment before she bowed in consent and left. And much later, Bayan laid in bed quietly as soft words floated from her lips. The song drifted into the air, the song her mother sang to lull Bayan to sleep. And the song she so often sang for comfort. But when even words brought her no relief, she uttered words she'd never thought she'd say. I might come to hate you, Your Majesty. Tears gathered in her eyes as she quietly begged him to come to her soon. And across the palace grounds, the emperor entered concubine Karen's chambers, where she sat, waiting for him, it appeared. He asked her about her sudden invitation to him when she'd been so adamant to avoid the emperor. But Karen only offered a smile in answer as she took the pitcher and filled the emperor's cup. And as she did so, Dan reluctantly admitted just how beautiful the concubine was. Yet for all her beauty, the emperor couldn't understand his discomfort towards the concubine, and so he studied her quietly. But soon the emperor's eyes rounded in shock as he took in the sight of concubine Karen's Adam's apple. A laugh broke from his lips as he stated aloud his thoughts. How had I not realized a man had stumbled upon my presence? Do you seek death? The emperor asked quietly, his voice having lost all traces of amusement. Instead of fearing the fierce emperor, concubine Karen smiled smugly as she stated that, in fact, she'd come all this way to live. The emperor recalled the reason for Karen's muteness, aphasia. But that appeared to be nothing but an excuse to conceal his deep voice. But the emperor dumped the contents of his cup out as he stated clearly that he had no interest in men. Karen's grin revealed that he shared the sentiment and that he'd come to the palace with other intentions. The emperor dropped his cup as he asked, "Did I give you permission to speak? You must have a death wish." But Karen explained that would not work in the emperor's favor because he was the only person who could prove that Lady Zhongin was a CO. But the emperor corrected him as he stated it was Lady Heian now. This news surprised Karen, and he knew that this only infuriated the nobles further. Then you will need me even more now, Karen said, and the emperor snickered softly at Karen's confidence. And so Karen explained the tale of the 3 sons once more. God had 3 sons, Taemyeryong, Geo, and Nungwamyul. These beings once existed a long time ago. Of the 3 sons, one was able to free himself from God's punishment. But the emperor was not impressed by Karen's tales and threatened him. Karen explained further, and if the emperor was not happy at the end, he could do with Karen as he saw fit, Karen said easily. He spoke with conviction, and the emperor gathered that this was not a fairy tale at the least. He also deduced that the aforementioned son must not be Taemyeryong since Dan still suffered from madness. Karen stated that Geo had freed himself from his punishment, which was forgetfulness. The emperor wondered how he had accomplished this if he had forgotten the very next day that he suffered from punishment. And when the emperor questioned the authenticity of this story, Karen explained it was true since he was living proof of this. And so Karen reintroduced himself as Karahan Barasi, Geo's descendant, the 3rd prince of Rayon, who had exceptional memory. The emperor knew Karahan spoke no lies since only royalty of Roan possessed the ash-gray hair. The emperor wondered how lax the administration was if the nobles had failed to identify royalty amongst the concubines. But the emperor questioned how Karahan's descendancy tied with the situation at hand. Karahan explained that Geu descendants began keeping records of everything so as to remember it all. The first 12 record keepers, known as the prime ministers, built towers in the names of their families, and these towers stored the information they gathered. Thousands of these towers now stand in the kingdom of Rayon, the tallest tower being named the Memory Chamber, which is owned by the Barasi royal family. The key to this tower is owned by the king of Rayon, also known as the Chamber Keeper. Dan determined that information and knowledge were power in the kingdom of Rayon. Karahan agreed and stated that his ancestors had collected and stored every book in the world. Ancient texts that are believed to be lost can be found within these towers, and Karahan just so happened to bring one of those ancient texts with him, the Legend of the CO. But the emperor scoffed at this because how could a mere book convince the masses that the Heian was a CO? They would accuse the emperor of having lost his mind enough to forge an ancient text. But Karahan implored the emperor to believe him, for he could solve their dilemma. But the emperor could not be swayed with just those words, and so Karahan explained that the nobles would use the excuse that the emperor needed saving from the curse placed upon him, and so they would condemn all his efforts, convinced they were evil deeds, including the newly appointed merit-based system. As such, the people would also start to believe in these rumors, and if this continued, the emperor would be dealt a heavy blow. This would be disadvantageous for Karahan as well, since they needed the emperor to remain in power. At his words, the emperor grinned as he realized why the third prince had come to him. Karahan needed Dan's support because he coveted the throne. And so Karahan did not respond directly to Dan's words. Through the legend of the CO, I shall prove Lady Heian innocent. In return, please help me become Rayon's chamber keeper, Karahan stated. The emperor grinned slyly, and Karahan wondered what he had up his sleeve, for he knew the emperor had no other options left. But before he could ask, a knock on the door stopped him. They announced that a fire had broken out in Lady Heian's chambers. Karahan sprang up from the chair, ready to run to Bayan's aid, but the emperor's voice stopped him. I give you a command, concubine Karen. You are prohibited from leaving your lodging along with entering the Heian's chambers. But Karahan couldn't understand why the emperor was so calm when Her Highness's chambers were ablaze. Karahan panicked at the thought of Bayan in danger, and as he shouted out at the emperor for an explanation, the emperor turned and left, giving none. Minutes before the fire, Suyan called out to Bayan, and she sprang up startled. Bayan looked at Suyan, bewildered. Suyan urged Bayan to dress quickly, but when she wasn't quick enough, Suyan stripped and dressed Bayan in inconspicuous clothes, leaving Bayan all the more confused. But soon Manhwa and Hassan appeared at the window as they too urged Bayan to hurry. Hassan ordered Bayan to get on his back, and soon he dashed forward, running faster than she could ever dream to. But what caught her attention soon left her even more perplexed. Her chambers up in flames, glowing brightly. But why were her chambers on fire? Hassan smiled excitedly at the vibrant colors but told Bayan to hold on. Soon he sprinted forward even faster and then vaulted over the palace wall. She shut her eyes tightly, but the voices soon sprang them open as they questioned if they'd make it to the carriage in time, which was stationed at the outer gate. She looked to their side to see Makrim and Gairang keeping pace with them. As they bickered jovially, Bayan wondered just what was going on. And soon Bayan sat quietly in the rattling carriage as it made its way to an unknown destination. She wondered the whereabouts of her maids and about the fire that broke out. She wondered about the black wraiths, who she thought abandoned her and how they knew to save her from the fire. And she wondered about their destination. But she wasn't concerned about her safety because she knew these people would never harm her. Soon the carriage came to a stop and Gairang popped in to inform Bayan that they would need to continue on foot since the road was too narrow for a carriage. And when Bayan stepped out, glad for the fresh air, she looked upon the structures before her with a chill. She looked back to see Gairang moving the carriages, and Hassan explained that they were getting rid of them. She knew soon she would need an explanation, and that was all the more necessary as they walked forward. The black wraiths scouted the area as if on the lookout for assassins. She took in the scenery, the abandoned building structures looking run down and in worse condition than her own back in the Ganek village. She hadn't known the Empire had places like this, she stated aloud, and Gairang explained that this village was an impoverished one that was now mostly abandoned. But the place wasn't altogether abandoned as Bayan had thought because soon they came to a building that was in much better condition, and Hassan urged Bayan to step inside. He informed her that this was where she would be staying for now. But before Bayan could take another step, she finally asked them their reason for coming here so late at night and in secret. But the two men didn't answer for a moment before Hassan deviated instead to telling her about her new dwellings. It may look shabby, but the inside was fairly good, and everything had been repaired by them, so it was very safe, he'd said. But Bayan was not interested in the safety of the building, and she demanded an answer. And so Hassan stated that he was prohibited from answering. This forced Bayan to draw her own conclusions. They'd fled the palace like a group of thieves at midnight after her chambers had caught fire, which also happened to be the same day that the people drew doubt about her origins. Bayan's stubbornness reared its head, and she told the men that either they explained why they'd fled in such a manner or she would turn around and leave. The men still hesitated, and so she asked, "Have I been banished from the palace?" At her question, the men paled and quickly assured her that it wasn't so. "Well, you should have had more courtesy before treating me like a piece of luggage," she said, and the men bowed and begged for forgiveness. Gairang tried to get Bayan to go inside, but Bayan was not having it. She ordered the men to take her back to the palace, and she marched past them, ready to leave. The men scurried behind her, ready to persuade her otherwise, but a loud, gruff voice soon rang out. The door of the building slammed open to reveal an old lady ready to beat them to a pulp. She scolded them for their noise at this time of the night. "If you're here, then get off your butt and come in," she shouted. The men blocked Bayan, protecting her from a potentially dangerous granny and her paddle, but soon they had to protect themselves from that paddle as the granny used it on said men. Gairang asked her if she would take responsibility if she hurt their guest, but the granny didn't believe there was any woman there as she stated that she smelt, but a bunch of putrid men. But before she could finish her statement, she paused as she took in the unfamiliar scent. She ordered them to move out of the way, and the grandmother approached Bayan. She opened her eyes slowly to reveal irises just like her mom's. Her cloudy white irises told Bayan that this lady was blind. Granny raised her hand as she urged Bayan forward, and after a moment's hesitation, Bayan gently grasped the old lady's hand. She patted Bayan's hand softly as she spoke of Bayan's arduous journey to get there with such ignorant men. "Have you had dinner, dear?" she asked, and Bayan stated that she had. And upon hearing Bayan's voice, she praised how lovely it was. And she expressed her wish to touch Bayan's face. She joked that it was nothing but an old lady's nonsense, but Bayan gave her permission to do so. She took Granny's hand and guided it to her face, and the old lady stroked Bayan's face slowly, as if painting a picture for herself, and with just a touch, she spoke of Bayan's beauty. "My knees are starting to give out from all this standing. Shall we head inside?" she said, and in that moment, Bayan was reminded of her mom, who so often complained just as Granny did. After a moment, Bayan headed inside with Granny, leaving the two men wondering about her sudden change in demeanor. Bayan stepped inside to find a sparsely furnished but clean and neat room, and she wondered if this was an inn. She glanced around, noting the new furniture, but what caught her eye was dozens of books stacked on shelves. And upon closer inspection, she realized that those books were hers. The grandmother offered Bayan a cup of tea, freshly brewed. Bayan took the cup gratefully and soon sat at the table with Granny and Hassan. Bayan was amazed that such an inn still ran in the almost desolate village. Granny explained that she'd been receiving aid from a benefactor for a long time. This information intrigued Bayan, and Granny explained that it's been well over 10 years now, and through him, she'd met the Black Wraiths. Bayan questioned how the man had helped, and Granny said that he'd sent her men and money, but what was peculiar to her was that every man that came smelt distinctly of iron, and she thought the reason for this was because they were often on the battlefield. Bayan instantly knew who Granny's benefactor was, and she grinned and looked knowingly at the Black Wraiths who sat quietly. They'd kept His Majesty's identity a secret, but she was pulled from her thoughts as Granny complained about her aching shoulders and Bayan offered her a massage. She received Bayan's offer well and complimented Bayan on her excellent skills. Bayan explained that she'd often done this for her mom, and when Granny told her to stop, worried about Bayan's tired hands, Bayan continued and instead wanted to hear stories about her benefactor. Granny said that back when she was young, the capital was modest and usually smelt of cooked rice. And at sundown, small groups would gather for a drink or two. But around 30 years ago, the town became impoverished because of the onset of conquests, and this had threatened their livelihoods. Nobles moved from the frontier and drove the common people to the outskirts by evicting the women and children from their homes while the men were sent to the battlefield. Many of the people who were chased from the capital settled down in this poor village. It had been more than 10 years since Granny had lost both her husband and only daughter, and after much grieving, she'd become a noble's concubine. His wife did not like her husband's decision to take in a concubine, and she'd slowly poisoned her over time. And while she'd survived, that was how she'd lost her vision. Having no will left to live, she'd stumbled over to a tree before she became fully blind, and she'd been ready to end things there when she met him. Bayan thought he'd saved Granny, but Granny stated otherwise. He'd arrogantly told her that if she was to die, she should do it without causing others any trouble. She should think about the bearer who would deliver news of her death and about the pitiful tree. He'd told her to use a method that wouldn't burden others. Granny was outraged that someone would say that to her, and by the sound of his voice, someone younger. But because of him, she was here today, alive and well. He was also the person who had established this inn, where he'd asked her to run the inn with the promise of income. But at the time, Granny couldn't understand who would come to this poor town for lodgings and how she could be a suitable innkeeper, being vision impaired. Her benefactor assured her that she wouldn't have to lift a finger and that her guests would pay as well as clean up after themselves. It sounded absurd to Granny, but she decided to trust his words, and at first, he'd only sent her money, but after some time, guests began to arrive one after the other, and while most were men who smelt like iron, women occasionally popped in for accommodation. She soon learned that they were soldiers from the battlefield, and as promised, they paid after cleaning up after themselves. And more often than not, they would occupy the many vacant houses in the village. So Granny spent most of her time brewing medicinal tea. Bayan now understood that the village was occupied by soldiers sent by the emperor for the last 10 years. She understood now that, for some reason, the emperor had sent her to this village for protection, and so she concluded that the palace was not safe anymore for her. Granny pulled her from her thoughts as she called out to Bayan. "You're that man's consort, aren't you?" she questioned, a question that left Bayan flabbergasted and unable to answer. She pointed at the black wraiths as she told Bayan that before her arrival, they'd stormed in and cleaned for days. They'd also swapped out all the furniture, and they'd brought in hordes of unknown books. Initially, she thought they'd lost their minds, but then, just this morning, they instructed her to stay up tonight since a very important person would be arriving. And now she knew that important person to be Bayan. But Bayan stated glumly her uncertainty about the person they spoke of since she'd been dragged her without any explanation. Granny assured her that while the man may be ill-mannered, he was a good person, and he must treasure her deeply since he'd sent her with these fools, she said, referring to the black wraiths. Bayan let out a heavy sigh, sure that the Granny was right, and upon listening to her, Granny suggested sleeping since a good night's sleep was usually the best cure. And so she chattered away as she guided Bayan to her room. Back at the palace, people gathered around Bayan's chambers, the fire now put out. They speculated that Bayan must have burned the place down out of fear of her identity being revealed. And with that, the people began to lose interest in the concubine being of Nagi descent as another rumor took its place. Another concubine, dressed in mourning clothes, kneeled in front of the emperor's palace since dawn, they said. And there, she begged for forgiveness. And that concubine was none other than concubine Karen, or, as we'd come to know him, the third prince of Rayon, Karahan. But the masses did not know his true identity yet. And in the emperor's office, Juhil informed the emperor that concubine Karen had been kneeling out front since early morning. But the emperor paid no mind to his advisor's words, and not bothering to look up, he stated that maybe she did so because she was a suspect of arson. But Juhil was not deterred and asked if the emperor could listen to the concubine's explanation. The emperor asked how she'd gotten out when he'd banned her from leaving her lodgings. Juhil looked at the emperor apprehensively, and before he could say another word, the emperor reminded him that he'd warned Juhil to end his surreptitious relations. Juhil now realized that the emperor had already known about his partnership with the concubine, and he bowed in apology, having been found out. "Did you know he was a man?" the emperor questioned, and Juhil's silence was all the answer he needed. What had he promised you? The emperor wanted to know, but Juhil did not break his silence. The emperor sighed at Juhil's stubbornness, and he did not doubt his advisor's loyalty since he knew how much Juhil had sacrificed for the emperor. The emperor was sure that whatever the concubine had promised Juhil, he'd accepted for the emperor's benefit. However, the emperor wanted Juhil to really consider if what the concubine had promised him was truly good for the emperor. The emperor's advisor stood firm in silence, and eventually the emperor agreed and granted concubine Karen an audience. His decision surprised Juhil, and he bowed in thanks to the emperor. But the emperor was not done with Juhil, and he warned him once again about his secret alliances. Juhil bowed in acknowledgement. And soon concubine Karen entered the emperor's chambers. But once the doors closed, Karahan glared at the emperor. "Was this your plan all along?" he asked the emperor. Dan noted his sour expression and praised Karahan for finally catching on. The prince demanded to know the whereabouts of Her Highness, but the emperor did not give anything away. Instead, he told Karahan that she would be back once the merit-based appointment system was put in place and she would return not as a concubine, but as a Tayan. He warned Karahan not to ask any more questions, for now he knew all he needed to. Karahan knew that since Bayan would return as a Tayan, it would not be long before she'd be promoted to Hagi. The prince realized that the emperor had conjured up this entire plan to distract the people until the rumors stopped so he could guarantee Her Highness's safety. He clenched his teeth in fury, trying his best to hold back his words, but soon they burst forth. He shouted at the emperor for burning down Bayan's lodgings. What about Her Highness's safety? What if she had been burned? But the emperor corrected him, for he did not burn down her lodgings, although he did give the order. Karahan was not convinced and spoke of the emperor's orders as being reckless and hasty since there were plenty of other ways, yet he had chosen to use fire. The emperor told him that was the most effective method to convince the masses without his involvement. But his explanation did not calm Karahan's anger. He questioned if the emperor had used fire because Her Highness had self-healing abilities, but the emperor did not take Karahan's questioning lightly. He told the prince that he'd only bothered explaining since Bayan held him in high regard. He warned the prince not to provoke him further. "Since you were kind to Bayan, I shall give you some advice," the emperor said. "Do not test the patience of someone more powerful than you, for I could end you here and now." The prince bit back his words, and when he spoke these words, they surprised the emperor. "Please throw me out of the palace." And when questioned, he explained that he would use his powers to prove that Lady Heian is a CO. He urged the emperor to dismiss him as a concubine so that he could aid Her Highness outside the palace, but the emperor's eyes glowed with danger at the audacity that Karahan displayed. "Have you lost your mind?" the emperor questioned. "Do you really believe that I would let you go free to approach her as a man?" Karahan bowed as he stated that he would disguise himself, and he promised that if Her Highness ever discovered his true identity, he would leave her side immediately. The emperor wondered why Karahan would go to such lengths, and he explained that you would like to become king. Only then would he become the chamber keeper who has possession of the world's information at his hands. The emperor wondered when he had given permission to reveal Her Highness as a CO, and he did not remember making a promise to help him become a king either. The prince was shocked and realized that the emperor's words were the truth. Didn't he need to remove all doubt about Her Highness before she sat on the throne? The prince questioned, but the emperor could easily handle that himself. But Karahan urged the emperor to reconsider and to accept his help. "I refuse to negotiate with you in her name," the emperor stated. Karahan did not give up, and he said that while the nobles may disappear, the suspicions and doubts that they raised would not. The people would continue to suspect Her Highness of being a Nagi. And the newly appointed officials would issue an appeal for both the emperor's sake as well as the empire. And so he asked the emperor this question: "Would you be able to turn your back on your counsel who speaks from the heart and not with self-interest?" And while the emperor has a plan, putting it into action would require time. Why is he certain that Her Highness wouldn't be wounded in the process? Karahan believed that this matter should be resolved swiftly while she was away from the palace. The emperor considered his words carefully and, after a moment, agreed to dismiss concubine Karen. Karahan thanked the emperor, and when the emperor addressed him, he now spoke to the Prince of Rayon and not the concubine. He recalled Karahan's words. He stated that the sons of God were fated to be drawn to COs, which meant that Karahan was included since the blood of Gaya ran through his veins. Karahan knew what the emperor implied and quickly assured the emperor that was not the case. The emperor doubted his words because, while he may have escaped divine punishment, he was not free from his bloodline. Karahan denied the emperor's words, but his blushing face said otherwise. The prince knew that the emperor's words were a warning to keep his heart to himself and away from Her Highness. And with a resigned look, he said, "I understand." The emperor ordered him to leave at midnight, and with that he left the emperor's chambers. As he walked away, he tried to deny his feelings for Her Highness but couldn't quite convince himself, and he thought about her radiant smile and brilliant chocolate brown eyes. Back at the safe house, Bayan slowly opened her eyes to whispering voices as they spoke of their accommodations. She woke up groggily and she called out to Suyin. Suyin greeted Her Highness using her title, but Magua quickly scolded Suyin for referring to Bayan as Her Highness. She was to refer to Bayan as my lady. Bayan paid them no mind as she questioned, was it all a dream? But her attendant assured her that this was no dream since this run-down building would never be the palace. Suyin urged her to get up since they would need to get ready for breakfast, but Bayan was still surprised at their appearance. When had they gotten here? Suyin explained that they'd spent the night outside the palace and then made their way to the inn this morning with the black wraiths. Bayan's mouth fell open in surprise as she realized they all knew about this plan except her. And so she scolded her attendant for sharing gossip about His Majesty bedding concubine Karen and refusing to visit Bayan's quarters. But Suyin insisted that they were only doing what His Majesty had commanded. They had no choice but to follow his orders. She pouted, annoyed that everyone had known about the plan but her. Magua informed their lady that breakfast was ready and Bayan was ready to go, but before that Bayan was to wash up and change out of her night clothes. Bayan hesitated for a moment and then asked if the emperor would visit. Suyin assured Bayan that the emperor would need to visit to quench his thirst, but for now this would prove difficult. Bayan's heart beat erratically at the thought of seeing the emperor once again. And when she left her room, her attention fell onto the black wraiths as they looked to be discussing something very important. Bayan drew to a stop as concubine Karen came into view. Upon seeing Bayan, the concubine's face brightened with happiness and Bayan rushed forward as she matched the concubine's enthusiasm. But how was she here? How had she left the palace? Makrim explained that the concubine had been kicked out since she'd forgotten to mention an important part of her body. His cryptic words left Bayan confused. Bayan wanted an explanation, but Makrim continued as he stated that while she'd been returning to her homeland she stumbled upon this inn. He glared at the concubine as he stated, quite a coincidence, isn't it? But Bayan wanted to know what she'd hidden for her to get kicked out of the palace. The men glanced around nervously, refusing to answer, and all the while concubine Karen smiled beautifully. She decided to let it go as she invited the black wraiths to breakfast. Makrim wondered if he'd heard wrong and questioned if that included them as well, but she said it plainly, of course. Gairang grew excited at the thought of eating together with Her Highness, while Makrim wondered if this was allowed. And soon rain came pouring down. Bayan watched the rain quietly as she sat at the table. Granny brought tea and Bayan thanked her. Bayan noted how heavy the rain was and she explained that where she lived before, rain rarely fell. Granny explained in the Empire seeing this much rain was normal and the rain would continue for half a month. So much so they'd cause landslides and would be impossible to prevent floods. But since their town was higher in altitude, they would be safe compared to the low-lying towns. Granny commented that the royal court should be providing support, but that was not the case, and Bayan commented that the emperor did the best he could, trying her best to defend her beloved. But Granny could not be persuaded and she stated that nothing would change with his corrupt underlings. Bayan informed her that this was the reason for the merit-based appointment system. But Granny shook her head in refusal and she stated that with rumors spreading about the emperor living under a Nagi's control, she doubted many people would take the exam. But she herself did not believe in the rumors. Bayan was surprised to hear this and questioned why. Granny explained that the rumored concubine actually kept the other concubines and ill-disposed nobles alive. It also made no sense that she did not take advantage of the emperor she'd bewitched. Bayan mentioned the nobles who had been beheaded in the past, but Granny explained that those nobles were infamous for bleeding the people dry. And since she'd never joined hands with those nobles, it proved that she was not of Nagi descent. Bayan smiled, happy that someone believed in her. Granny stated that later it would be revealed that the concubine had been framed and Bayan wanted to know why she thought so. Granny explained that when death is near, one experiences a premonition or two. She thought of it as heaven's way of making sure one didn't waste the little time they'd have left. But Bayan assured Granny that she had plenty of time left. Granny smiled gently at Bayan's words, but Bayan insisted that she would live a long life. Granny heard the plea in Bayan's words as she said, "Please do." And in the next moment, she laughed easily as she questioned the whereabouts of everyone. But Granny had seen through her jovial laughter and she noted that Bayan did not have a sheltered upbringing and she offered some advice. There is no need to feel sad or chained to your past, she said, since everything would balance out in the end. The more pain you experience, the more happiness you will reap later, so with all that you've suffered you're bound to experience more joy later on. Her words brought tears to Bayan's eyes, and she said softly that she was not sad, just homesick. Granny patted her gently on the shoulder in comfort and shortly after, she got up, ready to go see if the black wraiths had fixed the roof as they were instructed to do so. Bayan offered to go with her, but Granny stated that if she came out now they would only want to fool around and so it would be more helpful if she remained inside. Bayan smiled as she watched Granny walk away. She didn't hear the concubine approach and when the concubine tapped her on the shoulder, Bayan shouted out in fright. Concubine Karen placed the books on the table and Bayan looked at her questioningly. Concubine Karen explained that there were only 20 days left until the examination and Bayan would need to study. But Bayan was all the more confused as to what that had to do with her. And with a grin, Concubine Karen stated that she would be taking the exam and with that, she would also have to achieve the highest score. Her words surprised Bayan and she wondered why she would need to take the exam.